"Meet the family's A-Tim," my daughter-in-law said, raising her glass as if she had just delivered the most charming toast of the evening. And for a moment, no one corrected her, not even my own son, who stood beside her smiling like it was all perfectly normal, like I was just another detail in the room instead of the woman who had built everything they were celebrating that night. And I remember the exact second it happened because the string quartet was playing something soft in the background. Champagne glasses were clinking under warm golden lights, and my granddaughter, Emily, looked absolutely radiant in her white dress. The kind of moment that should have been preserved in photographs and happy memories. But instead, it froze in my mind for a completely different reason. Because in that instant, I understood something I had been refusing to see for years. Something that had been quietly unfolding behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't even lower my gaze. I simply stood there holding my glass, feeling the cool stem between my fingers, and I memorized every detail. The way Vanessa tilted her head slightly, as if she expected laughter. The way a few guests exchanged glances but said nothing. The way Daniel, my son, let out a small chuckle under his breath and avoided looking directly at me. And that silence, that collective decision to let the moment pass without correction, said more than any insult ever could earlier. That afternoon, I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting the soft blue silk dress I had chosen for the wedding. The one Emily once told me made me look elegant. I had taken my time getting ready, carefully styling my silver hair, fastening the pearl necklace my late husband had given me on our 40th anniversary, telling myself that today was about family, about love, about being present for the people I had spent a lifetime caring for. I had even arrived early to make sure. Everything was perfect, checking in with the coordinator, confirming the final payment for the reception had gone through, making sure no detail was overlooked because that's what I had always done, quietly handled things so everyone else could enjoy the moment. And yet somehow, somewhere along the way, that quiet support had been rewritten into something else. Something transactional, something expected, something that could be reduced to a single word spoken to a microphone in front of a room full of people. "Hey, Tim." I took a small sip of champagne, letting the dryness settle on my tongue as the music swelled slightly, and I smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks for approval or hides embarrassment, but the kind that comes when something inside you shifts into place, when confusion gives way to clarity, because in that moment, standing in the middle of my granddaughter's wedding, surrounded by laughter that no longer included me, I realized that this wasn't just a careless joke. It was a label, one they had been comfortable using for a long time, one they had finally decided to say out loud. And as I set my glass gently onto the table beside me, I made a quiet decision of my own. I would not correct her. I would not defend myself. I would not disrupt Emily's day with a scene that would only be remembered for the wrong reasons. Instead, I would watch, I would listen, and I would let them show me exactly who they believed I was, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to speak, it's to understand. And I had a feeling that before this night was over, I was going to learn far more than they ever intended. To reveal the applause came quickly after that, almost on cue, as if the room itself was eager to move past the moment and return to something more comfortable. And I watched as Vanessa lowered her glass with a satisfied expression, already turning her attention back to the guests gathered around her, accepting compliments on the floral arrangements, the seating chart, the flawless execution of the evening. And I realized then that she had rehearsed this, not the exact words perhaps, but the feeling of it, the positioning, the subtle way she could say something sharp enough to cut and still be wrapped in the language of humor. And what struck me most was not what she said, but how easily everyone allowed it to settle into the air without question, as if it belonged there, as if it had always been true. I moved slowly toward the edge of the reception hall, my heels soft against the polished floor, passing tables dressed in ivory. Linens and centerpieces I had personally approved just weeks before, each detail a reminder of the quiet role I play behind the scenes. I had written the checks, coordinated with vendors, ensured that Emily would have the kind of wedding she had dreamed about since she was a little girl. And yet now, standing there on the sidelines, I felt like a guest at an event I had built from the ground up. I paused near a group of distant relatives who had not seen me in years, and I heard one of them lean in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to create the illusion of privacy. "Well, at least she seems to take it well," she said, and another responded with a soft laugh. If I were footing the bill, I would want some recognition too, and I noticed how neither of them used my name, how I had already been reduced to a role, a function, something less than a person. I kept my expression calm, nodding politely as if I had not heard a thing, but inside, something continued to sharpen. Not anger exactly, but awareness, a quiet clarity that spread through me with each passing second. Across the room, I caught sight of Daniel speaking with one of his colleagues, his posture relaxed, his hand resting lightly at Vanessa's back when she approached him, and I watched as she said something to him, something that made him smile again, that same small, dismissive smile I had seen earlier, and for a brief moment, I wondered when that change had happened, when my son had learned to stand beside someone who could speak about me that way without feeling the need to correct it. I remember a time when he would have been the first to defend me, when he would have stepped in without hesitation, but that version of him felt distant now, like a photograph that had faded over time. I reached for a glass of water from passing tray, choosing it over champagne this time, needing something steadier, something that would not blur the edges of what I was beginning to see so clearly. The music shifted into a slower melody, and guests began moving toward the dance floor, laughter rising again, louder this time, filling the space that had briefly held that earlier moment, and I understood then that for everyone else, it was already forgotten, just a passing comment in an otherwise perfect evening. But for me, it had become something else entirely, a point of no return. I took a seat at a small table near the back of the room, folding my hands neatly in my lap, observing the way Vanessa moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, accepting praise, directing staff, positioning herself at the center of every interaction. And I began to notice the patterns I had missed before, the way she subtly guided conversations, the way she spoke about family contributions as if they were collective when they came from me and personal when they benefited her, the way she framed generosity as obligation. And I realized that this had not started tonight. This had simply been the first time she had said it out loud. I let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, and allowed myself to sit with that understanding. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. And as I watched the celebration continue around me, I made another quiet note, not about what had been said, but about what had not been said, about who had remained silent, about who had chosen comfort over truth. And I knew that those silences would matter just as much as any word spoken before this night was over the longer I sat there. The more the evening began to separate into layers. The surface one filled with laughter and music and soft golden light. And beneath it, something quieter, sharper, something that had been there all along, but had only now come into focus. I watched as Emily danced with her new husband, her smile genuine and bright, completely untouched by the undercurrent I was beginning to trace, and I felt a brief flicker of relief that at least she was still living inside the version of this night she deserved. But even that comfort was fleeting, because I could not ignore the way Vanessa hovered just at the edges of every important moment, guiding photographers, adjusting angles, ensuring that she was present in every frame that would be remembered. And I began to recall other moments, smaller ones, that I had dismissed at the time. The birthday dinner last year when Vanessa had jokingly thanked me for keeping the family funded, while everyone laughed. The holiday gathering where she had insisted on hosting but quietly handed me a list of expenses that needed to be covered. The way Daniel had slowly stopped asking for help and instead began to expect it, as if somewhere along the way, generosity had been redefined into responsibility, and responsibility into obligation. I folded my hands tighter in my lap, feeling the fabric of my dress beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present as the past rearranged itself in my mind with unsettling clarity. It was not one moment, not one careless joke. It was a pattern carefully built, reinforced over time, and protected by silence. I noticed how often Vanessa spoke in absolutes, how she framed decisions as already agreed upon before anyone had the chance to question them, how she positioned herself as the organizer, the voice, the one who spoke for the family, and how easily everyone, including my own son, had allowed that to happen. I thought about the house Daniel and Vanessa lived in now, the down payment I had quietly covered, the renovations I had helped finance, the countless small transfers and checks that had never been acknowledged publicly, and I realized that each of those moments had added another layer to the role they now saw me in, not as a mother, not as a person, but as a resource, something dependable, something expected, something that could be labeled and reduced without consequence. Across the room, Vanessa was laughing again, leaning slightly toward a group of guests, her hand gesturing lightly as she spoke, and I caught a fragment of her words as I passed by. "She loves to help. It gives her purpose," she said. And there was again that careful framing, that quiet rewriting of reality into something more convenient, something that removed choice from the equation and replaced it with inevitability. I slowed my steps, but did not stop, allowing her voice to fade behind me as I moved toward a quieter corner near the exit doors, where the noise softened just enough for me to hear my own thoughts more clearly. And for the first time that evening, I let the question form fully in my mind. Not what had she done, but how long had I allowed it? How many times had I smiled and nodded and told myself it was easier to keep the peace? How many times had I chosen silence over discomfort? And I did not ask that question with regret, but with precision, because understanding the answer meant understanding the shape of the situation I was now in. I reached for my phone, not to call anyone or to escape the moment, but simply to hold it, to feel its weight in my hand as a reminder that there were things I could still control, choices that had not yet been taken from me. And as I looked back over the room one more time, taking in the movement, the laughter, the carefully curated perfection of the evening, I felt that same quiet shift settle deeper within me. Not anger, not even sadness, but something steadier, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And I understood then that whatever happened next would not be decided in a moment like the one Vanessa had created, loud and public and easily dismissed. It would be decided in silence, in observation, in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. And as I turned slightly toward the hallway that led away from the reception, I allowed myself one final thought, not about what I had lost, but about what I had just found, clarity, and with it, the beginning of something they had not yet even considered. I did not go far, just enough to step outside the rhythm of the music and into a quieter hallway where the sounds of the reception softened into a distant hum. And for a moment, I stood there alone, looking at the framed photographs along the wall, images of other weddings, other families frozen in carefully curated happiness. And I wondered how many of those moments held truths no one could see, how many smiles concealed something quieter beneath them. I let out a slow breath and straightened my shoulders, not out of habit this time, but out of intention, because something had shifted inside me, and it was no longer about maintaining appearances. It was about understanding them. I returned to the reception floor not as a participant, but as an observer, and the difference was immediate. The same room, the same people, but now every interaction felt sharper, more defined. I noticed how Vanessa's voice carried just enough to draw attention without seeming loud, how she positioned herself slightly ahead of Daniel when they approached others, guiding the conversation before he could speak, how she used phrases like "we decided" and "our plan," even when I knew those decisions had never included me. And I realized that control for her was not about confrontation. It was about framing, about shaping the narrative so thoroughly that no one questioned it, not even the people inside it. I moved slowly past the dessert table, pausing briefly as a server adjusted a tray of small pastries. And I heard Vanessa again, this time speaking to a group of older guests, her tone warm, almost affectionate. "Margaret has always been generous," she said, placing just enough emphasis on the word to make it sound like a defining trait rather than a choice. "She likes taking care of things." And there was again that subtle shift, that quiet removal of agency, as if everything I had ever done had been driven by some internal need rather than deliberate decisions I had made out of love, out of commitment, out of belief in family. I kept walking, my expression unchanged, but my mind carefully recording each detail, each phrase, each glance, because patterns do not reveal themselves all at once. They emerge piece by piece. And now that I was looking, I could see them everywhere. I thought back to the conversations I'd had with Daniel over the past few years. The way he had gradually stopped asking how I felt about things and instead informed me of decisions that had already been made. The way he would say, "Vanessa thinks this is best," as if that alone settled the matter. And I realized that it had not been sudden. It had been incremental, each small shift barely noticeable on its own, but together forming something much larger, something that had quietly redefined my place in their lives. I reached the edge of the dance floor again and watched as Emily laughed, her hand in her husband's, completely absorbed in the moment. And I felt a brief ache that this day, which should have been untouched by anything but joy, had become something else for me. But I did not let that feeling linger because this was no longer about what had been taken. It was about what was still within my control, and control, I was beginning to understand, did not come from raising your voice or demanding recognition. It came from knowing exactly where you stood and deciding, with clarity, what you were willing to accept. I turned slightly and caught my reflection in one of the mirrored columns lining the room, the soft lighting casting a gentle glow across my face. And for a moment, I studied that reflection, not with doubt, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. I was not invisible. I had simply allowed myself to be seen in a way that served others more than it served me. And that realization settled into place with a calm certainty. Across the room, Vanessa lifted her glass again, drawing attention for another brief remark. Her voice light, confident, perfectly measured. And I watched her, not with hurt, not with anger, but with understanding, because once you recognize the structure of something, you begin to see where it can shift, where it can be undone. And as the music swelled once more in the room, filled with applause, I made another quiet decision, not to interrupt, not to confront, but to wait, because timing, I had learned over a lifetime, often matters more than words. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing for what would come next. It was not until I stepped closer to the far end of the reception, near the quieter tables where the older guests had gathered, that someone finally spoke to me in a way that did not feel rehearsed. And I recognized him almost immediately. Though it had been years since we had last spoken, Mr. Harrison, my late husband's attorney, standing there with the same composed posture and observant eyes I remembered, he gave me a small nod as I approached, not overly familiar, not overly distant, just enough to acknowledge that he had seen what others had chosen to ignore. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that did not belong to casual conversation. And I returned the nod, allowing a faint smile to settle on my face, the kind that kept things polite without inviting too much warmth. "It has been a long time," I replied, and for a brief moment we stood in silence, the kind that is not uncomfortable but intentional, as if both of us were measuring what needed to be said and what could remain. Unspoken, he glanced briefly toward the center of the room, where Vanessa was once again surrounded by guests, her presence as controlled and deliberate as ever. And then he looked back at me, his expression shifting just slightly, enough to signal that this conversation was not about pleasantries. "Your husband was very precise," he said, choosing his words carefully, and something in the way he said it made me focus more closely. He believed in structure, in clarity, especially when it came to family matters. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table beside me, not out of anxiety, but out of attention, because I knew that tone, the one that precedes information rather than opinion. He made certain arrangements before he passed. Mr. Harrison continued, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation contained between us. "Arrangements that were designed to protect you, not just financially, but structurally." I held his gaze, steady and calm, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "There are conditions," he added, "specific ones, regarding how assets are accessed, how authority is transferred, and under what circumstances those decisions can be altered." The words settled into place slowly, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something I had not fully explored before. I remembered the documents, the meetings, the careful explanations my husband had insisted I sit through even when I told him I trusted him completely. And now, standing here in the middle of a room filled with music and laughter, those moments took on a different weight. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice even, without accusation, and Mr. Harrison did not hesitate. Because I have been watching, he said simply, and because there are times when silence serves a purpose and times when it no longer should, I let that answer settle, appreciating its directness, its lack of embellishment. And for the first time that evening, I felt something shift again, not just clarity, but alignment, as if the pieces I had been quietly gathering were beginning to form a structure of their own. "You have more control than you are currently exercising," he added, his tone still measured. "But control, as your husband understood, is only effective when it is applied deliberately." I glanced once more toward the center of the room, where Vanessa's laughter carried easily across. The space, confident, unchallenged, and I realized then that what I had been witnessing all evening was not just behavior. It was assumption, the assumption that the structure beneath all of this was fixed, that the roles had already been decided, that nothing could shift without confrontation. And yet here, in a quiet corner of the room, I was being reminded that the foundation itself was far more flexible than they believed. I turned back to Mr. Harrison, offering a small, controlled nod. "Thank you," I said, and this time, the words carried more weight than courtesy, because they marked the moment when observation began to turn into intention. He returned the nod, understanding without the need for further explanation. And as he stepped away to rejoin the crowd, I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting the information settle into place, not rushing it, not reacting to it, but absorbing it fully, because knowledge, I had learned, is not powerful on its own. It becomes powerful when it is used with precision. And as I lifted my gaze back toward the room, taking in the movement, the conversations, the carefully maintained illusion of harmony, I no longer saw it as something I was outside of. I saw it as something I could navigate, something I could influence. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in perspective, not as someone who had been diminished, but as someone who had simply been underestimated. And that, I understood now, was a position far more advantageous than they realized by the time I stepped back into the center of the reception. Something had changed in the way I moved, not outwardly, not in any way that would draw attention, but internally there was a steadiness now, a sense of direction that had not been there before, and I allowed myself to blend back into the rhythm of the evening, greeting guests, offering polite smiles, responding just enough to maintain the appearance that nothing had shifted at all. Because that was the advantage I now understood. They were not watching for change. They were comfortable in the version of me they believed in. And comfort makes people careless. I approached one of the long tables where a few extended family members were seated, people who had always been cordial but distant, and I noticed how their tones softened when they spoke to me, how their words carried a hint of assumption, as if they were already aware of my role without needing confirmation. "Everything looks beautiful," one of them said, gesturing lightly around the room. "You must be proud," and I nodded, allowing a small, measured smile. "It is a lovely evening," I replied, choosing not to correct the implication, not to clarify what I had contributed or what I had not, because clarification would only disrupt the narrative that was currently working in my favor. I moved on before the conversation could deepen, continuing through the room with quiet intention, observing more than participating, and I began to test something, small at first, subtle enough to go unnoticed. I declined to engage in a conversation about future family plans when Vanessa casually mentioned expanding their home again. I responded with a neutral acknowledgement instead of the usual willingness to help, and I watched her reaction. Carefully, just a fraction of a pause, a slight tightening around her smile before she recovered and redirected the conversation. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it told me everything I needed to know. Expectation had already been set, and any deviation from it, no matter how small, registered immediately. I continued this pattern, offering less, speaking less, allowing space where there had once been automatic agreement. And with each small shift, I observed the reactions around me. The subtle recalculations, the quick adjustments in tone, the way Vanessa began to check my responses more closely, as if trying to determine whether something had changed or if she was imagining it. And I made sure to give her nothing definitive, no clear signal, just enough ambiguity to keep her uncertain. Across the room, Daniel was speaking with a group of colleagues, his posture relaxed, His attention divided between the conversation and the movement around him, and I approached just close, enough to be included without announcing myself, listening as he described future plans, renovations, investments, all spoken with a confidence that suggested decisions had already been made, and I noticed how easily my contributions were implied, but never acknowledged, how naturally he spoke as if the foundation for those plans was simply there, unquestioned. I waited for a moment when his attention shifted toward me, just briefly, and when our eyes met, I offered the same calm expression. I had maintained all evening, neither warm nor cold, just present, and for a second I saw something flicker there, something uncertain, as if he was trying to reconcile the version of me he expected with the one he was now seeing, but the moment passed quickly, and he turned back to his conversation, dismissing it as easily as he had dismissed everything else. I stepped away again, not lingering, not pressing, because this was not about confrontation, it was about observation, about allowing the existing structure to reveal itself fully before making any decisive move. I reached for another glass of water, holding it lightly as I moved toward the edge of the room once more, and I allowed myself to take in the entire scene, the music, the laughter, the carefully orchestrated celebration that now felt less like a family gathering and more like a performance. Each person playing their role, each interaction reinforcing the same unspoken assumptions, and I realized that what I had been given tonight was not just clarity, but timing, the opportunity to act, not in reaction to a single moment, but in response to a pattern that had now fully revealed itself. And as I stood there, watching Vanessa move through the crowd with the same effortless control, I understood something with complete certainty. She believed the structure was fixed, that the roles were permanent, that the foundation beneath all of this belonged to her and Daniel now. And that belief, more than anything she had said or done, was the one thing that would make what came next possible. Because people are most vulnerable when they're most certain, and I intended to let that certainty remain untouched. At least for now, the evening continued exactly as they expected it would, smooth, controlled, predictable. And that predictability became my greatest advantage, because once you understand how a system functions, you can begin to move within it without disrupting its surface, and that is precisely what I did. I allowed myself to return to familiar patterns just enough to avoid suspicion, responding politely when spoken to, offering the occasional approving nod when Vanessa described her plans for future gatherings, even allowing a soft smile when Daniel mentioned how well everything had come together, as if none of it had shifted beneath my feet, and I could see the relief in their expressions, subtle but present, the quiet reassurance that whatever hesitation they might have sensed earlier had been nothing more than a passing mood. And that was important because doubt, if left unresolved, leads to caution, but reassurance leads to carelessness. I moved through the room with measured ease, pausing near conversations without fully joining them, listening more than speaking, and the more I listened, the clearer the structure became. Vanessa was already discussing post-wedding plans, future renovations, financial projections, all spoken with the same assumption of continuity, as if the resources she relied on would always be there, as if the foundation beneath her plans was permanent and unquestioned. And I noticed how she referred to those resources not as something external, not as something that belonged to someone else, but as something inherently tied to their future. "We are thinking of expanding the property next spring," she said at one point, her tone confident, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. "It just makes sense with everything we have available." And no one asked what she meant by available. No one questioned the source, because in their minds, it had already been defined, already accepted, and I stood there just long enough to register the assumption before stepping away again, not correcting, not clarifying, simply allowing the statement to exist as it was. Because every assumption made without challenge becomes evidence later. I found myself near the gift table, where neatly wrapped boxes and envelopes were arranged with careful precision, and I watched as Vanessa briefly checked the placement, adjusting a card here, repositioning a ribbon there, her attention to detail impeccable, her control over the environment absolute, and I could not help but notice how naturally she moved in that space, as if it belonged to her entirely, as if every element of the evening was an extension of her authority. And I realized then that her confidence was not just about personality. It was about certainty, the certainty that nothing beneath her would shift, that the structure supporting her position was fixed, and that certainty, more than anything else, was what made her vulnerable. I turned slightly and caught sight of Daniel again, this time alone for a brief moment, checking his phone, his expression neutral, and I approached just enough to stand beside him without interrupting. "It is a beautiful evening," I said quietly, and he looked up, offering a quick nod. "It really is," he replied, his tone casual, comfortable, as if everything was exactly as it should be, and I studied his expression for a moment, not searching for guilt or awareness, but for understanding, and what I saw was something else entirely. Expectation, the quiet assumption that the future would unfold exactly as it had been planned, that nothing would require adjustment, that nothing would be taken away, and I nodded once in return, allowing the conversation to end there because there was nothing I needed to say, not yet. As the music shifted once more and guests began gathering for the next part of the evening, I stepped back again, returning to the edge of the room where observation was easier, where perspective remained clear, and I allowed myself to take in the entire scene one more time, not with emotion, but with precision, identifying the patterns, the assumptions, the roles each person had accepted without question. And I understood that what came next would not require force. It would require timing, patience, and the careful application of everything I had just learned. Because when people believe they are secure, when they believe nothing can change, they stop paying attention to the details that matter. And those details, I now understood, were exactly where everything could shift. And as I stood there calm and composed, I made one final decision for the night. I would let them leave this wedding exactly as they arrived. Confident, certain, completely unaware that the structure they relied on had already begun to move beneath them. The night began to wind down in the way all carefully planned events do, slowly at first, and then all at once, the music softening, guests gathering their belongings, laughter turning into quieter conversations near the exits, and I remained exactly where I had been for most of the evening, just outside the center of it all, watching as the final moments unfolded with the same polished ease that had defined everything else. Vanessa moved through the room one last time, offering graceful goodbyes, thanking people for coming as if she alone had orchestrated the entire evening. Her voice warm, controlled, perfectly measured, and I noticed how often she repeated the same phrases, how consistently she framed the night as a collective effort while subtly placing herself at the center of it. And I allowed myself to step closer, not enough to interrupt, but enough to hear clearly, because sometimes it is in the final moments, when people believe everything is complete, that they reveal the most. "We could not have done it without the support we have," she said, her tone light but deliberate. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "It really makes everything possible." And I recognized the phrasing immediately, vague enough to avoid specifics, clear enough to reinforce the assumption that the resources behind her plans were stable, guaranteed, unquestioned, and I felt a quiet confirmation settle into place. She was not just relying on that assumption. She was building on it, expanding it, shaping her future around it. And that meant she had already committed to a version of events that depended entirely on something she did not actually control. I turned slightly as Daniel joined her, placing his hand lightly at her back, his posture relaxed, his expression satisfied, and I listened as they spoke with a small group of guests about what would come next. "We're thinking of making some changes to the house soon," Daniel said, his tone casual, confident, and Vanessa nodded beside him, adding details, timelines, ideas that extended months, even years into the future, and no one questioned how those plans would be supported. No one asked where the foundation for those decisions came from, because in their minds, it was already settled, already secured. And I realized then that this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not a dramatic reveal, not a confrontation, but a quiet confirmation that their certainty had reached its peak, that they were no longer cautious, no longer measuring their words. They were speaking freely, openly, assuming stability where there was none. I stepped forward just enough to be included in the edge of the conversation, offering a polite smile as their attention briefly shifted toward me, and Vanessa's expression brightened slightly, that same practiced warmth returning instantly. "Margaret, everything turned out beautifully, did it not?" she said, and I nodded, meeting her gaze with the same calm composure I had maintained all evening. "It did," I replied, my voice steady, unhurried, and I let a brief pause follow, just long enough to settle, just long enough to create a space where expectation could form, because they were used to me continuing to offering something more: agreement, support, reassurance. And when I did not, when I simply held the moment and allowed it to pass without filling it, I saw it again, that flicker, that brief hesitation behind her eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but unmistakable. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, his expression unchanged, but his posture adjusting just enough to suggest awareness. And I understood that even the smallest deviation, even the absence of something they had come to expect, was enough to register, enough to create a subtle imbalance. And that imbalance, if allowed to grow, would reveal everything. I stepped back then, not lingering, not pressing further, because the moment had served its purpose. The confirmation had been made, the assumption had been spoken clearly enough to stand on its own. And as I moved toward the exit, retrieving my coat from the attendant with a quiet "thank you," I felt no urgency, no need to act immediately, because what I had gained tonight was not something that required instant use. It was something that required precision, timing, and patience. I paused briefly at the doorway, looking back once more at the room, now half empty, the lights slightly dimmer, the energy fading into the kind of quiet that follows a long day, and I saw Vanessa and Daniel still standing at the center of it, confident, composed, completely certain that everything ahead of them was secure, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to them, but to the understanding that it settled fully into place, because the structure they believed in had already begun to shift. They just did not know it yet. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, closing the door gently behind me, I carried that knowledge with me, steady, controlled, and ready to be used when the moment was exactly right. The next morning arrived without urgency, without drama, just a quiet continuation of everything that had been set in motion the night before, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the sunlight filtering softly through the window, illuminating a space that felt entirely my own in a way it had not for a very long time. I did not rush. I did not reach for my phone to check messages or respond to anything that might have come in overnight. Because this was not a moment that required reaction. It required intention. I let the silence settle around me, steady and undisturbed, and I allowed myself to revisit the evening, not emotionally, not with hurt or resentment, but with precision, replaying each conversation, each assumption, each carefully phrased statement that had revealed more than intended. And by the time I finished my coffee, there was no uncertainty left, only clarity. I reached for the folder I had not opened in years, the one my husband had insisted I keep somewhere safe, the one he had walked me through page by page while I listened with only partial attention, trusting him completely, trusting that I would never truly need to understand the details myself. And now as I opened it and began to read, I realized just how deliberate he had been, how carefully he had structured everything, not out of control, but out of protection. There were clauses I had overlooked, conditions I had not fully appreciated, safeguards designed not just to preserve assets, but to ensure that authority remained exactly where it was meant to be. And as I moved through each page, I began to see the full shape of what had been built, not just for me, but around me, a structure that could not be altered without my consent, a system that required my active participation in every major decision, and most importantly, a set of conditions that allowed me to redefine everything at any time, without explanation, without negotiation. I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table in front of me, and for a moment I simply sat there, not overwhelmed, not surprised, just aligned, because everything I had observed the night before now had context, now had weight, now had direction. I reached for my phone then, scrolling briefly before selecting a number I had not called in quite some time. Mr. Harrison answered on the second ring, his voice calm, prepared, as if he had been expecting this call. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, and I allowed a small pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty. I would like to review the arrangements, I said, my tone steady, clear, and there was no need to explain further. He understood immediately. Of course, he replied. I will prepare everything. And as the call ended, I set the phone down beside the folder, feeling no need to rush the next steps, because this was not about urgency, it was about precision. The days that followed would look from the outside exactly as they always had. Conversations would continue, plans would be discussed, assumptions would remain unchallenged, and that was exactly how it needed to be, because what was about to change did not require announcement. It required execution. I stood up slowly, carrying my cup to the sink, rinsing it. With the same deliberate care I applied to everything else, and I allowed myself one final thought, not about what had been said at the wedding, not about the moment that had started all of this, but about what would come next, because I understood now that power does not come from proving someone wrong. It comes from allowing them to believe they are right until the moment that belief no longer serves them. And when that moment arrives, it does not need to be loud. It does not need to be dramatic. It simply needs to be final. I dried my hands and glanced once more at the folder resting on the table. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle fully into place. Not just clarity, not just control, but certainty, and I knew with complete confidence that when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice, I would not need to explain myself, I would simply act. And everything they had built on assumption would quietly, completely, and irreversibly change at her granddaughter's wedding. An elderly mother is publicly humiliated by her daughter-in-law, but what seems like a simple moment of embarrassment slowly reveals a deeper pattern of manipulation, control, and quiet betrayal that has been building for years. This emotional journey unfolds as one of the most compelling family stories where dignity, silence, and awareness become the foundation of a powerful shift. As the elderly mother observes the behavior of her daughter-in-law and her own son, she begins to recognize how her generosity has been reframed into obligation, how her presence has been reduced to a role rather than respected as a person, and how assumptions about her support have quietly shaped the future plans of those around her. Unlike typical family stories filled with loud confrontations, this story moves with calm precision, showing how control can be reclaimed without raising a voice, how understanding patterns can become more powerful than reacting to a single moment, and how silence can reveal more than words ever could. The daughter-in-law confidently builds her image and authority within the family, believing everything is secure, while the elderly mother begins to see the structure beneath it all, recognizing that what appears fixed can in fact be changed. This is one of those unforgettable family stories where the emotional tension builds through observation rather than conflict, where each detail matters, and where the truth unfolds gradually through small but significant realizations. As the night progresses and the assumptions of the daughter-in-law become clearer, the elderly mother quietly prepares for a shift that will not be announced, not be argued, but simply executed at the right moment. This story stands out among family stories for its realistic portrayal of emotional intelligence, generational conflict, and the subtle dynamics of power within a family. It is a narrative about respect, identity, and the consequences of taking someone for granted, all told through a calm and controlled voice that reflects strength rather than vulnerability. For those who appreciate deeply layered family stories, this journey offers a powerful reminder that sometimes the strongest response is not immediate, not loud, but carefully timed, precise, and impossible to ignore. Character 1 is a 68-year-old white elderly woman with silver hair, styled neatly. She wears an elegant blue silk dress and pearl necklace. Front-facing portrait, realistic lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon. No selfie, no illustration. Calm expression. Subtle strength. Character 2 is a 35-year-old white woman with polished blonde hair and sharp features. She wears an elegant designer dress at a wedding. Front-facing portrait. Confident expression. No cartoon, no cartoon. No selfie. No illustration. Controlled presence.